Evelyn Zumaya reads AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you. From page 231, Chapter 12, Hoping to be Kindly Remembered. New York City, the spring of 1924. In 1924, the going rate for a New York City police officer's silence was $40 a night. The temptation to refuse bribes from restaurant and club owners was too great for many of New York's finest, and they often pocketed the cash to look the other way while bootleg liquor was served with abandon. Although the Volstead Act of 1919 banned the sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages, by 1924, a devil-may-care attitude about the legislation so permeated mainstream America that even ardent supporters of the noble experiment admitted prohibition was a bust. Most club owners simply surrendered to the times, reviewed their accounting ledgers, and decided it was better business to slip regular payoffs to the police than to deprive local paying customers their liquor. A few New York City police precincts became so corrupt during the height of Prohibition that Police Commissioner Enright launched a campaign to rout out the worst culprits. In March of 1924, he executed one of his most successful undercover stings in a Queens nightclub and arrested one incorrigible offender on the police force, Chief Inspector of the 12th Division, Thomas J. Kelly. Chief Kelly was charged with the non-enforcement of prohibition laws and the acceptance of bribes. Every member of his precinct was subpoenaed to testify during his impending trial. The list of officers scheduled to appear on the witness list included one of Chief Kelly's most loyal officers, who had worked by his side for the past 7 years, Luther H. Mahoney. No officer in the 12th Division was comfortable at the thought of incriminating their boss from the witness stand, and Lou Mahoney was no exception. As Chief Kelly's trial drew closer, Lou and his two brothers, Charles and George, also New York policemen working in other precincts, made their move, a move out of town. On April 30th, 1924, Lou Mahoney surrendered his badge and officially resigned from Chief Kelly's precinct. His brothers followed suit in their respective precincts. 18 members of the Mahoney clan then crammed their worldly belongings into 4 cars in preparation for the long drive west to their parents' home in Los Angeles. Lou Mahoney did not leave his home at 96 Canal Street quietly, and on May 6th, the morning of his departure, he placed a telephone call to the local press. In light of the upcoming trial of Chief Kelly, news of the resignation of 3 police officers was enough motivation for a few reporters to investigate Lou's story. By the time the press arrived, Lou had built up a head of steam and gave them an earful about the public's shameful treatment of Chief Kelly and his precinct by saying, quote, "Out west they are friendlier than here. We cops stand a lot of abuse. Being a policeman is a tough job, and when we get to California, we hope to go into the trucking business. No more policeman's life for us," end quote. The publicity opportunity was not lost on the 3 Mahoney brothers, and their respective families posed for the press in matching khaki safari outfits. A lone cameraman cranked his newsreel camera as the Mahoneys waved goodbye to their neighbors and drove down Canal Street. Despite Lou's brief public defense of his former superior at the precinct, Chief Thomas Kelly, would receive no support from his ex-officer in the courtroom that spring. Lou would ensure there were plenty of miles between himself and that hot seat. Just inside Grand Central Station's 42nd Street entrance, an elderly man sat slumped on a folding chair next to his small display of fruit. His handwritten cardboard sign read, "For sale." It was a nippy spring evening in early May, and business was not brisk. So when 3 well-dressed New Yorkers paused to eye his fruit, he rallied with a pitch. Fresh plums, fresh, juicy plums. The old man's hopes for a sale at that moment were pinned on Rudy, Natasha, and George. But at that late hour, the weary vendor did not recognize the handsome movie star bending down to select one of his plums. "How much?" Rudy asked. 10 cents, the man replied. Rudy raised an eyebrow, set the plum back in the crate, and looked the vendor in the eye, saying, "I won't pay 10 cents for a prune." Natasha ignored Rudy's rebuke and began filling a small paper bag with the plums, while George stepped forward to count out the change for the purchase. Rudy didn't sputter long about the indignity of paying a dime for a plum, and before walking another city block, he was munching on the fruit. If Rudy could sign for a purchase on credit, he did not hesitate to spend his money extravagantly. He imported his Abdullah No. 5 black tobacco Turkish cigarettes, an expensive English shaving soap packaged in hand-polished wooden bowls by the case, and had these expensive items shipped directly from the manufacturer. However, if the deal required reaching into his pocket, no matter how grand the acquisition or how juicy the plum, it was a different story. Those awkward moments were left to George. Rudy's tight-fistedness with his cash on hand was not due to any thriftiness on his behalf, for by the time he and Natasha returned from their Hotel Negresco New Year's celebration to settle into their lavishly appointed new apartment at 270 Park Avenue, any fiscal restraint on their behalf was a distant past. It was George's sole responsibility to fund this lifestyle of unparalleled spending. In this endeavor, he not only struggled to maintain their shaky household budget, but the budget of Rudy's next movie, Monsieur Beaucaire, as well. George's original budget for the film was decimated, as Natasha hired a scenic artist, a costume director, 4 wardrobe assistants, an art selector, an interior decorator, an assistant, an expert draper, a supervisor of makeup, a fencing master as her husband's coach, a dancing master, a poetry reader, a violinist, and 2 valet assistants. The ever-expanding payroll added considerably to Monsieur Beaucaire's escalating production costs and threatened any amicable working relationship between George and Natasha. Their professional affiliation grew more volatile, as Rudy seldom made the slightest move without first consulting his manager. His increasing reliance upon George did not bode well with Natasha. Nevertheless, George negotiated the occasional détente with Natasha as he continued to secure the funding necessary for her Monsieur Beaucaire directives. Her relationship with Beaucaire's director, Sidney Olcott, did not fare as well. Olcott grew exasperated and made several failed attempts to prohibit Natasha from previewing the daily rushes of filming. But as Rudy's contract ensured his complete artistic control over production, Natasha's wishes were never seriously challenged. The final edit of Monsieur Beaucaire was ultimately hers, with the film's final price tag totaling just over $500,000. This figure did not include a few substantial financial outlays incurred during filming by the Valentinos that were not paid for by famous players Lasky. During the production of Beaucaire, both Rudy and Natasha extended themselves personally as well as financially in the promotion of their individual discoveries. In one instance, Rudy asked George to negotiate a screen contract for the film's leading lady, Doris Kenyon. After a few days of negotiations, George secured a 1-year contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, which guaranteed Miss Kenyon $500 a week plus all expenses. One of Natasha's protégés exacted more of a financial sacrifice. The handsome young reporter she met in Paris the previous year, André Davin, accepted her invitation to visit New York. Just as she'd promised, Natasha ensconced him in regal style in their Park Avenue apartment and cast him in Monsieur Beaucaire. To George's frustration, Natasha also granted Davin the ability to charge all of his expenses on her various personal accounts around New York. George soon realized that Monsieur Davin could spend money with as much abandon as his benefactress. The Frenchman rang up enormous tabs, despite complaining in letters to his Parisian girlfriend that he was only earning $60 a week for his work in Beaucaire. He also borrowed large sums of money from the Valentino's personal friends, which he never repaid. While Davin was busy stiffing the Valentino's friends, he was also writing home explaining how he tagged along on a hunting trip with Beaucaire's star. He also wrote that Mrs. Valentino set up a little office space for his use, complete with a used typewriter. There, he said he planned to do some part-time clerical work for an extra $50 a week. By the time Dobbin completed his few scenes in Monsieur Beaucaire, Natasha's interest in her discovery waned, and future roles for him in the movies were not forthcoming. He did not return to France in obscurity, however, before completing a dental makeover with Natasha's dentist. Apparently, Dobbin's teeth were a wreck because the dentist charged a small fortune for the extensive work. The dentist forwarded this substantial bill to George for payment just a few days after Dobbin quietly left for Paris without the meekest au revoir to the generous Madame Valentino. When George informed Rudy that Dobbin had skipped town, leaving him holding the bill for his dental work, Rudy was so furious he could not be calmed down. He yelled at Natasha, criticized her willingness to extend his line of credit, and told George to forward an immediate statement of indebtedness demanding full payment from Monsieur André Dobbin. A few weeks later, George received Dobbin's reply, stating that he had no intention of paying Mr. or Mrs. Valentino 1 franc. He went on to explain how he felt they owed him money, as they interrupted his newspaper career in Paris. For this, he said, he held them responsible for time lost. George's daily lectures advising Rudy and Natasha to curb their expenditures were inevitably followed by their earnest assurances they would be more frugal. But by the time work ended on Beaucaire, they were spending a reported $1,000 a night in New York auction houses, purchasing choice pieces of antique armor, weaponry, ivory carvings, books, and tapestries. One evening, Rudy attended the American Art Association's sale, where he purchased, again on credit, 2 16th century family portraits of the Duke and Duchess of Savoy for $640. He then topped this extravagance by signing for a $475 purchase of a 15th century carved walnut chest. With the sets already under construction for Rudy's next and final movie with famous players Lasky, The Sainted Devil, the much-anticipated end to his hostile relationship with the studio was tantalizingly close. The prospect of his impending ability to earn even more money, starring in his own independent movies, inspired both Rudy and Natasha to borrow against those future, fatter paychecks with a vengeance. The Sainted Devil was loosely based upon a gruesome story of murder, revolution, and misery set in Haiti. The original story was written by Rex Beach and first published in Cosmopolitan magazine in May of 1913 under the title of Rope's End. By the time famous players Lasky converted Rope's End into a screenplay, the plotline had gone south. Sainted Devil was rewritten as the story of a South American Don whose wife was kidnapped by bandits. Despite the watered-down script, Rudy found his character of a drunken, volatile Latin lover an easy fit, and allowed makeup artist to leave his pronounced scar on his cheek exposed to grant his character edge. He would play opposite an impressive lineup of beautiful actresses, Helen d'Algy, Louise Lagrange, and Natasha's friend Nita Naldi. Amid rumors Rudy was too smitten with co-star actress Jetta Goudal, Natasha promptly replaced her by hiring Dagmar Godowski. To work by her side designing the Sainted Devil's costumes, Natasha hired Adolphe Adrien Greenberg, a graduate student fresh from the Manhattan branch of Parsons School of Design. Her sponsorship of André Dobbin had fallen flat on his expensively reconstructed teeth, but Adrien would become one of Natasha's most successful protégés. Monsieur Beaucaire's screenplay writer Forrest Halsey and photographer Harry Fishbeck were again contracted for work on The Sainted Devil. But Beaucaire's director Sidney Olcott could not be convinced to work another minute with Natasha and was replaced by director Joseph Henneberry. As filming on The Sainted Devil got underway, Natasha and Rudy spent their time away from the set, attending auctions, browsing through antique shops, and sifting through the bookshelves at the Gotham Book Mart with Francis Steloff. When Natasha's custom-built Isotta Fraschini cabriolet finally arrived from Paris, she became the envy of all New York as she rode around Manhattan in the one-of-a-kind vehicle. Tucked in the cabriolet's velvet-upholstered single bucket seat, Natasha was protected from the public's prying eyes and her Italian chauffeur by a partition of ornately etched smoked glass. With New Yorkers clamoring for any news about the Valentinos, Rudy and Natasha did all they could to keep their profiles low. Despite their meager security measures consisting of George, studio security guards, and the cabriolet's glass partition, during the summer of 1924 they were vulnerable to fan harassment and often sought safe retreat in the homes of trusted friends. That summer, Rudy assumed his role as Bobby Ullman's proud godfather by spending many afternoons tossing the squealing tyke in the air and roughhousing with Bobby's 6-year-old brother, Danny. Rudy was also a favorite visitor in Frank Manillo's home, where a 14-year-old Arnold Manillo pressed him for more dance instructions. Arnold so emulated his Uncle Rudy that he covertly organized his own nightclub act that summer with a considerably older danseuse from the George White scandals. Arnold performed with a professional dancer for 6 weeks before his father learned about his son's nightly gigs around New York. Frank put an end to Arnold's nightclub act and laid down the law. No son of his would pursue a career as a professional dancer. It was also during the summer of 1924 that Rudy and his friend Oscar Odd McIntyre waged a heated competition to find the loudest tie in New York. Oscar Odd McIntyre wrote the popular column New York Day by Day, and he and his wife Maybelle were close friends of both the Valentinos and the Ullmans. Odd would claim victory in the loudest tie contest after telephoning Rudy with a request that he stop by his apartment to view the winning entry. When Rudy knocked on Odd's door one hot summer day, he was wearing a pair of fur earmuffs in order to, quote, stifle the din of Odd's blaring cravat. During July and August, the Valentinos, the Ullmans, and the McIntyres were all frequent guests of New York antique dealer Victor Miller. Although an invitation to dine with Victor Miller in his Manhattan apartment inevitably meant participation in one of his after-dinner seances, the greater enticement to spend an evening with Victor Miller was the prospect of enjoying one of his haute cuisine dinners. Miller bragged to his guests that he prepared the meals entirely by himself. But as no one had ever seen him boil water, none of his friends believed the claim for 1 minute. While the Valentinos' friends did their best to shield them from the public's fanatical pursuit, Rudy's popularity continued to soar. Despite the fact that he had not released a movie in 2 years, he was crowned King of the Movies at the Theater Owners' Ball at New York's Hotel Astor. But as the day of Monsieur Beaucaire's premiere grew closer, odds makers placed their bets and deemed the success of the film a long shot. New York columnists joined in the debate and filled their columns with speculation. Would Monsieur Beaucaire launch Rudolph Valentino's triumphant return to the movies, or bomb at the box office and mark an embarrassing end to his career? On August 24th, long lines of moviegoers wound through the streets surrounding New York's Mark Strand Theater. The odds makers and the naysayers in the press did not deter Rudy's fans from turning out en masse to see for themselves whether he still had what it takes. Each showing of Monsieur Beaucaire was filled to capacity, and initial reviews raved over the gorgeous production. But by the time fan magazines hit the streets with their reviews, it was evident that some viewers were not so swept off their feet. They weren't so sure how much they enjoyed watching Rudolph Valentino in a movie where his only action scene was a brief fencing duel. No one disputed that Natasha's attention to historical detail and her art direction made Monsieur Beaucaire a visual masterpiece. But fans preferred their Rudy Valentino a little more wicked and a lot more dashing. It seemed Monsieur Beaucaire's polished, courtly restraint left many audience members on the edge of their seats, hoping that the tippy-toed action would cut loose and entertain. After such a long wait for Rudy's next film, audiences were rewarded with meaningful bows and head nods instead of hot desert pursuits and passionate embraces. Many of Rudy's frustrated fans placed their protests squarely upon Natasha's lithe shoulders, and rumors began the predictable swirl alleging the sheik was subject to his wife's controlling will. Men in particular found Natasha's influence appalling and vented their displeasure at this dominant woman who seemed to fit no known standard of the ideal aproned wife. By marrying the sheik, the great lover, the king of the movies, Natasha had positioned herself as prime target for an onslaught of henpecking insinuation. If her authority over her husband's career challenged men's perceptions of a wife's place in the home, women's reactions directed against her were more visceral. For millions of Rudy's female fans, she lived the fantasy role they held desperately dear. She shared a bed with their heartthrob, Rudolph Valentino, and that alone made her all too easy to hate. However, Rudy's public was unaware he was quite satisfied with his wife's take-charge attitude, and as sole stockholder of Cosmic Arts, she held the controlling interest over his studio contracts. In fact, by 1924, Rudy was deferring to Natasha so frequently that a frustrated George Ullman believed he was growing mentally lazy in her presence. With George and Natasha running all aspects of his everyday life as well as his professional career, Rudy was free to occupy his time away from work, enjoying his favorite daily diversions. For a short while, he demonstrated some interest in those college textbooks George provided for him, and he expressed a sincere desire to learn to play the piano. His Park Avenue apartment was strewn with the open textbooks and littered with sheets of his poetry and automatic writing scribblings. Each day he awaited the delivery of Cora McGeechee's automatic writing missives and weighed her messages from Blackfeather and Messalope with solemn consideration. Based upon his analysis of her communiques, he then scrawled copious notes for the following day. However, during the summer of 1924, it would be Natasha and not Rudy who would write in all seriousness. Assuming the pen name of Justice Lane, she began work on a screenplay for Rudy's first independent film, to be produced by J.D. Williams' new production company, Ritz-Carlton Pictures. Natasha's screenplay would go through several title changes. Her work was initially titled The Scarlet Power, and then changed to The Flame of Destiny, before finally becoming The Hooded Falcon. Her screenplay was a reworking of the story of El Cid, the legendary Spanish military leader who led his forces against the Moors. Rudy's character in the film was that of the 11th century hero. Natasha planned to have the film shot entirely on location in Spain, and estimated the cost of the epic production at $1 million, twice that of Monsieur Beaucaire. When Natasha pitched her proposal to Ritz-Carlton Pictures president J.D. Williams, he agreed to produce The Hooded Falcon as Rudy's first independent movie. Williams did not agree to film the movie on location in Spain, as he was a seasoned veteran in the relatively young motion picture business. He knew only too well that filming a movie abroad added considerable cost to its production. Williams was anxious to move forward with Natasha's Hooded Falcon project, as he was contractually obligated to pay Rudy a weekly salary whether he was working or not. And so it was upon Williams' approval of The Hooded Falcon that Ritz-Carlton Pictures advanced Rudy and Natasha a $40,000 line of credit for props and research materials which they would purchase in Europe before filming commenced. Williams handed the advance to the Valentinos along with some stunning news. Rudy's Ritz-Carlton Pictures, including The Hooded Falcon, would not be filmed in New York but in Hollywood. He went on to explain that he planned to publicize his fledgling production company on the West Coast, where he hoped to sell more stock. This was thoroughly depressing news for Rudy and Natasha, as Williams had effectively just ordered them to relocate to Los Angeles immediately upon their return from the Hooded Falcon shopping trip abroad. With great resignation, they instructed George to set plans in motion for their return to California. Natasha's friend and Rudy's co-star Nita Naldi accepted their request to star in a leading role in The Hooded Falcon and agreed to join them on their European shopping excursion. While Nidinaldi, Rudy, and Natasha were abroad, George would begin the laborious process of orchestrating the Valentinos' move. He would also be closing his own home in New York, as he, Bea, and the boys would be moving to Los Angeles as well. Before Rudy left for Europe, he confided in George that he had no intention of ever setting foot in Los Angeles before his outstanding debts were paid and all of the legal collection actions against him were settled. As soon as he, Rudy, Natasha, and Nita sailed out of New York, George headed in the opposite direction on a train bound for California. When he arrived in Los Angeles, he opened the Valentinos' Whitley Heights home, hired a domestic couple, and leased an office and a home for his family. In his new role as production manager of Ritz-Carlton Pictures, he negotiated the lease of studio space in Hollywood where Rudy would film his independent movies. George narrowed his choice of studio space to 3 studios: United Studios on Melrose Avenue, Pickford Fairbanks Studios, and Selig Studios. He made his final decision to lease lot space from United Studios. In mid-September, he and J.D. Williams sat down with United Studios president M.C. Levy to sign a contract making the largest and best-equipped leasing studio in Hollywood the new home of Ritz-Carlton Pictures. Meanwhile, set designer William Cameron Menzies had just begun his work drafting Natasha's preliminary set designs for the Hooded Falcon. That September, Bill Menzies would spend a great deal of time in his new office on the United Studios lot. And one morning his work was interrupted by a telephone call from his wife. After learning her car had just broken down, he said he would send someone right over. Bill Menzies left his drafting table and walked across the studio yard in search of the nearest lot mechanic. Spotting a pair of coverall-covered legs stretching out from under a truck chassis, he asked the half-hidden worker if he could take a look at his wife's stalled car. The grease-covered mechanic slid out from under the vehicle, wiped his hands on a dirty rag, and nodded. When Menzies returned to his desk, he telephoned his wife with the news that he'd taken care of her problem. "A mechanic's on the way, dear. His name is Lou Mahoney." 6,000 miles away in Paris, Rudy was raving over his new Voisin Roadster. The coveted automobile he ordered the previous year was polished, primed, and ready for his first road test, the drive south to Juan-les-Pins with Natasha. Traveling companion Nita Naldi opted to remain in Paris, but promised to join her friends on the Riviera as soon as they returned from a scheduled Hooded Falcon shopping foray to Spain. Rudy and Natasha then drove out of Paris in the shiny new Voisin, with their sole passenger on this voyage a gift from their friend Jacques Hebertot, a magnificent Doberman pinscher named K-Bar. The sole purpose of this trip abroad for Rudy and Natasha was the purchase of artifacts for the Hooded Falcon, and consequently their visit to the Hudnut Chateau was brief. They left for Spain with Aunt Teresa Warner and Muzzy almost immediately after their arrival in Juan-les-Pins. In Madrid and Granada, Natasha researched costume design in local libraries, and she and Rudy purchased antique cloaks, Spanish shawls, masks, armor, and weaponry. One memorable Sunday afternoon, Rudy, Natasha, and Muzzy attended a bullfight in Seville, which was sponsored by the local Red Cross. Seville's Red Cross charity event was a huge success that day, as the entire city, from royalty to humble workers, turned out to cheer as several unlucky bulls were released into the ring for sacrifice. When the afternoon's final kill snorted before the matador, the roaring crowd was on its feet, hurling hats, jewelry, and scarves into the ring. In one spectator box, Natasha and Muzzy tugged frantically on Rudy's coattails as he stood teetering on the box's railing, yelling himself hoarse. When Rudy entered the Seville arena earlier that afternoon, he arrived lugging a movie camera and a cumbersome still camera, all in the hopes of capturing some of the very scenes he portrayed 2 years earlier in Blood and Sand. But he found the action in the ring so riveting that he never snapped a single photograph. Instead, he joined the cheering crowd, and when hats were flung into the sand, he spun his beret in with the rest, jumped up onto the box's railing, and shouted over the din to Natasha and Muzzy, "I'm through with the movies. I'm going to be a matador." He was convinced that somewhere in that bloody arena he saw his future. Natasha and Muzzy dismissed his enthusiasm as a passing whim, but he vowed one day to return to live in Spain and study the art of bullfighting. On the return trip to Juan-les-Pins, he did little else but plead his case for his bright future as a bullfighter in Seville. Upon their arrival at the chateau, Rudy and Natasha found that Nita had just arrived from Paris, and a tour of the chateaus of the Loire Valley was quickly organized for her benefit. It was during this spontaneous excursion that Rudy, Natasha, Nita, and Muzzy toured the 15th century fortress at Loches. This infamous fortress had once been used as a military prison by King Louis XI, and in 1924 his dungeons were a popular tourist attraction. The exploration of the king's dungeons required the precarious navigation of winding corridors and steep stone stairways. Muzzy and Nita refused to venture into the dungeons and thought the idea of touring any site where confessions were routinely tortured from political prisoners just ghastly. But Rudy and Natasha found the lure irresistible, and they began picking their way through the dark passageways while balancing themselves with one hand on the damp stone walls. The two adventurers were so unfazed by their expedition they soon separated to explore on their own. Within a few minutes, Rudy heard a bone-chilling scream echoing through the maze of tunnels. Convinced some tourist had tumbled down one of the dungeon's long staircases, he sprinted along the stone corridors in the hopes of offering assistance. Unable to see where he was going, he stumbled into a wide chamber 2 stories high. Just at that moment, the awful screaming ceased, and on the dimly lit far wall of the dungeon, a skeleton hung suspended in wrist and ankle manacles, its bony feet dangling a few inches from the stone floor. As Rudy later related the spine-tingling tale, at that moment the skeleton vanished into thin air, leaving only iron chains swinging against the wall. This experience ended Rudy's fascination with dungeons, and he, Natasha, Muzzy, and Nita made a speedy retreat to the Hudnut Chateau. There they initiated preparations for an immediate return to the less supernatural streets of New York City. While they were sailing across the Atlantic, a postcard from Spain arrived at the Manhattan address of Oscar Odd McIntyre. The image on the postcard made its arrival a noteworthy event. Rudy, standing next to a goat, had written the following inscription across the card. "The one with a beard is the goat." Odd McIntyre was the first to know. In anticipation of his impending role as El Cid in the Hooded Falcon, Rudy had grown a beard. The Master Barbers Association of America reacted to this development during their 1924 annual convention in a ballroom in Chicago's Hotel Sherman. On the agenda that year was a proposed boycott of Rudolph Valentino's films. When the issue was put to a vote, the Barbers unanimously passed a motion stating that if Rudolph Valentino did not immediately shave off his beard, they would boycott his movies. A few days earlier, on November 11th, Rudy returned from Europe with Natasha and Nitinaldi, sporting the neatly trimmed goatee. With his awesome sway over young men's fashions, this was truly a horrifying development for the men who made their living shaving whiskers from the chins across the land. From the floor of their convention, the Master Barbers alleged Valentino's beard threatened their very livelihood, and they argued that if American men dared follow his lead, they would scarcely be distinguished from Russian men. Although their anxiety may have had merit, the truth was the motion to boycott Rudy's films at the annual convention was prompted by none other than famous Players Lasky's publicity genius, Harry Reichenbach. What better way to promote the opening of The Sainted Devil than to instigate a furor at the Barbers' Convention over Valentino's goatee? While America read about the Barbers' protest of Rudolph Valentino's facial adornment, George was working day and night putting the finishing touches on the grand move to California. He returned to New York well in advance of Rudy, Natasha, and Nitinaldi's arrival from Europe, but by the time he met the 3 weary travelers, he was reeling from an ugly, heated exchange with J.D. Williams. Williams had just informed George that Rudy and Natasha exceeded his $40,000 advance by charging on his line of credit an additional $60,000 worth of artifacts. He then proceeded to say that he'd changed his mind and now found Natasha's hooded Falcon a dreadful choice for Rudy's first film. Neither of these two problems seemed surprising or insurmountable to George. But William's next tidbit of information certainly was. He informed George he had just sold the distributing rights to Rudy's independent films, made with Ritz-Carlton, back to Famous Players Lasky and their distributing company, Paramount. He added he had also accepted funding for Rudy's independent films from the Famous Players Lasky Corporation. George could hardly believe what Williams was saying, as Rudy's contract had apparently been sold to the very people he swore he would never work for another day in his life. George tore into Williams and made it clear he had broken the terms of his contract with Rudy. Williams replied it was already a done deal, to which George replied something to the order of, "You son of a bitch, bastard, and double-crossing bastard." The two men came close to fisticuffs before George managed to calm down long enough to conclude the conversation. He told Williams in no uncertain terms that if Rudy ever learned of his double-cross, he would go on strike again, and this, George said emphatically, must be avoided at all cost. Despite his profound distress over this development, George assured Williams he would not pursue legal charges against him for his obvious breach of contract if he agreed to keep any news of Famous Players Lasky and Paramount's involvement from Rudy. Williams agreed to say nothing as long as Rudy complied with his contract with Ritz-Carlton Pictures. Privately, at that moment, George considered Rudy's contract with Ritz-Carlton null and void, and decided he would do something about the situation as soon as possible. Saying nothing to Williams about his intentions, he resolved Rudy would never spend another day unemployed, and immediately sought a new contract for Rudy with another production company. Before George left that contentious meeting, Williams handed him a final bit of bad news. He said that Rudy's first independent film would be a film based upon the Broadway play Cobra, and not Natasha's Hooded Falcon. George knew the play and told Williams it was a ludicrous choice for Rudy. He reminded Williams that Cobra bombed on Broadway, and despite producer L. Lawrence Weber's best attempts to keep the show running, the show closed after 63 performances at the Hudson Theater. Furthermore, George added, as Rudy contractually had the final say about his choice of screenplays, he would advise him to reject the project and continue with his plans to produce Hooded Falcon. Williams responded with a blank stare. J.D. Williams kept his word to George and did not reveal the identity of those, quote, wealthy New Yorkers funding Rudy's films to either Rudy or Natasha. But before the Valentinos made their exodus for the West Coast, one more meeting with Williams was convened. Williams seized the occasion to reiterate to Rudy and Natasha that their unauthorized $60,000 they spent in Europe added considerably to the overhead of Hooded Falcon, and explained that screenwriter June Mathis had been working on the film's script and found it a difficult task. Williams continued with his litany of snags by reporting that Hooded Falcon's budget was being cut in half, from $1 million to $500,000, and nary a single frame of footage would be shot in Spain. It was then he reopened the discussion of Cobra as Rudy's first film with Ritz-Carlton. Cobra was a contemporary drama, and Natasha did not hesitate to tell J.D. Williams she had no interest in having anything to do with such films. Rudy added that he knew the popular play and felt it was all wrong for him. No decision was made on Williams' proposal to produce Cobra, and George, Natasha, and Rudy abruptly left the meeting. George and Natasha were adamant Rudy refused Williams' offer to produce Cobra. A few days later, Rudy stunned them both. When he calmly made the announcement, he decided to comply with Williams' wishes and begin work on Cobra as soon as they arrived in Los Angeles. Once again, George repeated that the film was a dreadful selection. Before he could elaborate further, Rudy said his decision was final, as he had just received instructions from Blackfeather through Cora Medici to accept the role. This ended the conversation, as both George and Natasha knew better than to argue with Blackfeather. During the Valentino's final days in New York, George sold Natasha's Isotta Cabriolet for $7,000, the same price Rudy originally paid for the luxury vehicle. He also shipped Rudy's larger Isotta limousine, purchased for an outrageous $12,000, to California. In order to oversee the advanced publicity in Hollywood for the Valentino's return, George boarded an earlier train west with his family. When Rudolph Valentino returned to California with his beautiful wife Natasha, their friend Nita Naldi, designer Adrian Greenberg, and an assorted entourage and menagerie, George had already been hard at work for days, ensuring the press was out in full force. As reporters snapped their photographs of Mr. and Mrs. Valentino's smiling faces, they failed to capture a certain malaise obscured from the public's view. The move to California was generating substantial conflict between Rudy and Natasha. After a 2-year absence from Los Angeles, Rudy was eager to be home, but it was no secret Natasha hated Hollywood. The previous year, she published a tirade against the evils of the motion picture industry and the, quote, yellow shadow of graft brooding over Hollywood. As she smiled for the cameras at the train station in Los Angeles, she was poised to confront the industry she considered so despicable. Rudy gave a great impression to the crowd at the train station that he was on top of the world. The fact was otherwise. His wife's misery was already having its melancholic effect upon their uprooted household. Returning to their Wedgwood Place home was no light undertaking, and with renovations underway and rooms jammed with boxes, trunks, and antiques, life was anything but restful. Crews of workmen rushed about, polishing the black marble floors and setting up towering metal scaffolding. The long-abandoned home was freshened with noxious coats of canary yellow, silver, Chinese red, and black paint. While the Valentino's hillside home was being refurbished and repainted, new furniture was delivered and the yard uprooted for landscaping. Surveying the chaos before her, Natasha suggested to her husband and George that perhaps what they really needed was a larger home. As renovations on the property grew more extensive, the household staff expanded with the hiring of a groomsman and a full-time gardener. Whenever the construction projects required additional manpower, muscle was borrowed from the United Studios lot. Such was the case when Natasha's plans for an aviary required the excavation of a trench to facilitate the installation of a fountain. The task of digging this trench was assigned to a studio lot mechanic, Luther Mahoney. He arrived at the Valentino household upon glowing recommendation from Bill Menzies. The new day laborer, Lou, arrived early every morning, worked late every night, and befriended the downhearted Mrs. Valentino, as he referred to her. Meanwhile, Rudy avoided the turmoil of the renovations and his wife by spending most of his time out of the house. Early every morning he drove to nearby Griffith Park to ride horses before returning home for his breakfast. After breakfast, he either drove to the United Studios lot on Melrose Avenue to work on the set of Cobra, retreated to his garage, or engaged in a lengthy sparring session with his trainer or George. Despite George's busy schedule, he never refused an opportunity to lace on a pair of boxing gloves and go a few rounds with Rudy. Rudy and George shared a passionate interest in boxing, and they were not only active participants in the sport, but avid fans. One of George's first orders of business upon his arrival in Los Angeles was the purchase of a block of 8 seats in the American Legion Arena. There, without exception, every Friday night, the Valentinos and the Ullmans were seated ringside. Usually decked out in a beret, a pair of knickers, and a tweed sport coat, Rudy cheered in Italian if an Italian pugilist was in the ring, and in English if the boxer was American. On a few occasions he cheered in Spanish, along with actress Lupe Velez, for the American Legion's Mexican boxers. The crowd always knew when Rudy was in the stadium. He was loud, especially after he had a few drinks. It became one of the most demanding aspects of George's job during the fall of 1924 to prevent the press from reporting any news of Rudy's increasingly rowdier public indiscretions. George continued to issue his stock press releases and censor all copy written about Rudy before it was released to fan magazines. He did so in a calculated effort to portray Rudy as having no more than a glass of wine with dinner and behaving at home and in public as a veritable Boy Scout. In fact, a loyal fleet of bootleggers provided Rudy with cases of top-shelf liquor, and after his return to Los Angeles, he was often inebriated. He drank quantities of liquor far more often than he had in New York, and to make matters worse, he was becoming a disagreeable drinker. This disturbing trend presented such problems for George, he retained 3 public relations men with powerful connections with the press and police. He placed these men permanently on the payroll. Rudy's fans knew nothing of his drunken behavior or the efforts of the whitewash team, keeping the distressing facts from the public. One of these harrowing incidents occurred after Rudy announced to George, B., and Natasha that he was driving them all to San Diego for dinner at the beachside resort, the Coronado Hotel. The 4 friends left Los Angeles on the 3-hour road trip, traveling south along the Pacific Coast Highway in Rudy's Voisin Roadster. Once inside the Coronado Hotel's restaurant, Rudy was recognized, and women began swarming around him. George diplomatically tried to move the women along. Rudy was not in a magnanimous mood, waved his arm in the air in defiance, and demanded loudly that he be left to his dinner. It was not long before the situation became intolerable, and Rudy began elbowing his way through the persistent fans, storming out of the restaurant and heading for the Voisin. With George, B., and Natasha barely seated in the car, Rudy hit the accelerator and careened onto the highway to drive further south to Tijuana, Mexico. Ignoring George's protests, he bore down on the road and insisted they spend the night gambling in the casino. George demanded to take the wheel, as he knew Rudy had already had far too many shots of whiskey from the flask he kept in his coat pocket. Rudy would hear none of it. A short while later, Rudy stood before a grand roulette wheel in a Tijuana casino, where he ordered round after round of Scotch whiskey. He quickly gambled away a small fortune, and with each loss he increased his next bet and became more belligerent. Natasha and George's shushing only incited him to bark louder at everyone. When the casino's security demanded he shut up or they would summon the local police, Rudy staggered a few steps and bellowed, "To hell with the Mexican police." A Mexican police officer just happened to be in the casino at the time, but was thankfully out of earshot. However, a casino security guard heard Rudy's rant and waved the police officer over to the gaming table. When the officer heard how Rudy had just damned him to hell, he sidled close to Rudy and asked him in his broken English, "What did you say?" By then George had a tight grip on Rudy's arm and leaned in to whisper in his ear, "For God's sake, Rudy, say viva the Mexican police." Rudy flashed a withering look of disgust at the security guard, wrenched his arm from George's grasp, and took another staggering step of defiance in the police officer's direction. Recognizing the impending fisticuffs, George grabbed Rudy, spun him around, and slugged him full force in the jaw. His fist delivered enough of a blast to end Rudy's drunken rant and prevented the officer from arresting him on the spot. Before Rudy knew what had hit him, George was shuffling him to a nearby table, while Natasha rushed to retrieve a cup of coffee for her dazed husband. Within the next few minutes, Rudy gulped down a cup of coffee and was scuttled out of the casino towards the Voisin. Unfortunately, before George managed to shove him out the nearest exit, Rudy was squarely recognized. He put up no further fight when George refused to allow him to drive the return trip to Los Angeles. During the wee hours of that night, George and his 3 publicity men made their calls and managed to prevent any mention of the hubbub in Tijuana from appearing in the morning papers. By the following morning, Rudy had once again sobered up, was racked with remorse, and making his apologies to anyone who would listen. Thankfully for George, generating positive press for Rudy was always an easier feat. Just before Christmas that year, he staged an elaborately coordinated press event in honor of barber Ellis G. Bond's public shaving of Rudy's infamous goatee. Soon after this highly publicized shave, Rudy was seized by more than his usual near-paralyzing paranoia, and he became convinced his hair was falling out. He could not be persuaded to the contrary, and steadfastly believed the master barbers of America had zapped his famous head with a curse. In an effort to ward off the barber's bad mojo, he began carrying amulets and ordered a toupee. On December 21st, 1924, soon after his public shaving, Los Angeles Times reporter Alma Whitaker interviewed Rudy on the set of Cobra. Stroking his pale, bare chin, Rudy lamented to Miss Whitaker how the whiskers had itched and that he was actually relieved they were finally gone. He then expounded upon his work on Cobra and praised his wife's editing abilities for the box office success of Monsieur Beaucaire. Quote, "I made Monsieur Beaucaire without interference and was allowed my own way in everything under my contract with famous players Lasky. But I did not cut or edit the picture myself. My wife did that. I do not think the actor can bring his best judgment to bear in cutting a picture himself." In response to a question Miss Whitaker posed about his childhood, Rudy replied he was a, quote, "very troublesome boy who occasioned his mother much sorrow." He then explained to Miss Whitaker that she could, quote, never know the sorrow that he caused his poor dear mother in the days before he left Italy. This piqued the reporter's interest, and as she pressed on, Rudy was in no mood to hold back. "I fell in love with a woman as old as my mama," he lamented. Alma Whitaker asked, "You don't mean that women fell in love with you that young, do you?" "No, ladies do not fall in love with me," Rudy sighed. "What about all those piles of fan letters?" Alma asked him. "Oh, they are in love with the characters I play, not with me, the man. That is why I disapprove of personal appearances. I fall so short of their ideals of the characters I play when they see me in an ordinary modern suit." He then abruptly changed the subject. "Isn't it dreadful to see those fine trees being cut down in the street outside the studio there, just to make a street wider, and they take 50 years to grow to such beauty?" Sensing her interview had come to an end, Alma Whitaker requested an autograph and handed Rudy a pen and one of his publicity photos. He held the pen and the glossy photograph for a moment before obliging her request by scrawling across the bottom of the print, "Hoping to be kindly remembered, Rudolph Valentino." On Christmas Day 1924, Natasha's gift to her husband was a solid platinum slave bracelet, which he had permanently welded onto his wrist. His gift to his wife was a diamond-encrusted wristwatch. With an affectionate kiss, Mr. and Mrs. Rudolph Valentino exchanged their gifts that Christmas morning in the presence of Bea and George Ullman and their 2 little boys. Despite the exchange of these cherished gifts, Rudy and Natasha had been up all night fighting, and by dawn they were barely speaking. Nevertheless, early Christmas morning, Natasha telephoned George with the news that Rudy had a great surprise planned for the Ullman boys. "Come over at once," she said. By the time the sleepy-headed Ullman boys arrived at Wedgwood Place with Mom and Dad, Uncle Rudy and Auntie Natasha had apparently made up and were all smiles. Since Uncle Rudy's surprise was not quite ready, the Ullman family stood in the foyer with Natasha waiting for the okay to be sounded. While George and Bea restrained their fidgety boys, Natasha filled them in on the night's quarreling. She said that a number of things sparked the rough night. Rudy's recent purchase of 6 vicious falcons he planned to keep as pets, his long hours away from home, and her anxiety over the future of Hooded Falcon. George listened to Natasha and swallowed his fear that she or Rudy would learn of J.D. Williams' double-cross before he could negotiate a new contract for Rudy. He did not tell Natasha that at that moment he knew her Hooded Falcon was a doomed project, nor did he tell her he was already in negotiations with another production company. By the time Cobra wrapped, he hoped to have a brand new contract ready for Rudy to sign with Joe Shank's United Artists Studios. On that Christmas morning, Rudy and Natasha believed the future of Rudy's independent film career was still rosy, and the truth was no one doubted he reigned unchallenged as king of the movies. American women were completely under his spell, and no movie star was more dreamed upon that Christmas Eve than Rudolph Valentino. But unknown to his adoring public, he had just spent that night catching a terrible cold, arguing for hours with his wife, and sniffling his way across his living room floor with an oil can and a screwdriver. He had labored until dawn constructing an expensive toy train by linking the intricate fastenings of the metal track and wiring several transformers. Natasha fumed over her husband's extreme effort, but at last the entire living room floor was covered with several tiny villages and 2 trains steaming around miniature bends, woo-wooing right on cue. By the time the sun rose on that Christmas morning, an exhausted Uncle Rudy had blown his nose beet red as he stood like some great giant surveying his impeccable countryside on the living room floor. He gave a call to the Almonds and Natasha that everything was finally ready. Santa Claus really came through for the Almond boys that year. Baby Bobby was too young to remember the sight of the magnificent train, but Danny never forgot it. Thanks for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 13, titled The Kestrel Feed. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. As always, you may find your copy of AffairsValentino on Amazon and all online book-selling venues.